there is also a proud history of women. Not that many years ago, 40% of the teachers, the nurses, the doctors, the professionals across all sectors of business were women. And many of us, especially Women for Women International and the work that they are doing, believe that investing in the women in that country is the way back to a country where not just 40%, but 50% of the women are in those jobs, that all opportunities are open to them, and that they are given the chance to be the change agents that they can be for that country's future. We welcome an example of a resilient, remarkable Afghan woman, Noorjahan Akbar. She's a leading figure in Afghanistan for women's rights, and as you heard earlier, she's the co-founder of Young Women for Change. She's also running a social media campaign called Free Women Writers, because Noorjahan herself is a writer and an activist. Welcome, Noorjahan. It's a great privilege to honor and welcome these two guests, David Rohde and Kristin Mulvihill. Their personal story can take us inside the story of Afghanistan in a way that very few can. I imagine all of us have read David's Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting as a journalist covering Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bosnia. He's given us, I think, some of the best insights we have to what is going on in those countries, and he expressed to me earlier a deep affection and commitment to those countries that began early for him as a reporter. His captivity and his release are recounted in an extraordinary book. I definitely recommend you read it, called A Rope and a Prayer, A Kidnapping from Two Sides. And let's start there with Kristin and David. You've been married only a short while, less than 2 months. No, that won't make sense when we talk about the children later. No, I didn't express it right. They had been married only 2 months when David was kidnapped.
I was hoping you'd skip that part.
I know, because it's not your favorite part of the story of your relationship with Afghanistan. But I will ask you to start there so that we have a better understanding of both what happened and of course, ultimately your release. So would you begin, David?
You know, I was one of the many journalists who rushed into Afghanistan in 2001 when the Taliban fell. I covered it for 7 years. And I was writing a book about, you know, had these American efforts really worked or not? And I was following around an Afghan woman in southern Afghanistan, in Helmand. It's one of the most remote conservative provinces. I found out that there was this huge American aid program during the Cold War where these American aid workers built a town called Lashkargah, and there were so many Americans for so many decades that they actually called the town Little America. And I met Fauzia Olomi. She was the head of women's affairs for this province, and she told me these amazing stories in the 1960s of going to high school and having an American teacher, a Peace Corps volunteer, and she would speak broken English to me, and she literally could sing the words to Puff the Magic Dragon still. And this was the new Afghanistan and this great American and Afghan partnership to bring the country forward. I then met this incredible woman in New York and was trying to end my time covering Afghanistan and move back to New York, stop being a foreign correspondent, get married, and live happily ever after. But I wanted to start, I fell in love with this country and the positive side. You're going to hear a theme of dichotomy of two different Afghanistans, one that inspires and one that frightens. But I was very inspired and still am by the country.
But when you did go back, that turned out to be the worst possible time for you.
Yeah, my original sin, I talked about this in captivity with my two Afghan colleagues, was ambition. I got married, was on my last trip to Afghanistan, finishing up reporting for this book I wanted to write, and I decided I had this great female character, you know, there's a moral here, for men, and I decided I needed another male character, a Taliban commander, and that was a huge mistake. He had done interviews with 2 other journalists. They were European journalists. He had not kidnapped either of them. I decided I would go meet with him and just outside of Kabul, and it seemed to be okay because he had not grabbed these other journalists. But when we arrived at the meeting, immediately myself and there was an Afghan journalist and an Afghan driver with me, we were abducted.
Here you are, Kristin, at home, 2 months married to this man. How did the news come, and what did you begin immediately to do?
About 2 weeks after we returned from our honeymoon, I started a job at Cosmopolitan magazine as the photography director. I had worked at various women's magazines over a course of 20 years. And I was actually in my office, and I was producing a shoot for Cosmo, and I got a phone call saying that he didn't return from his last interview and that it was an interview with a Taliban commander. And I was very quickly thrust into this world. There was just a huge learning curve for me, not only in terms of the Afghan culture, but in terms of our government. The FBI came to the apartment, trained me how to answer the phone if I got a call from David or from his captors, which I did. And just the course of the next few months, it was crazy. I mean, I maintained my job at Cosmo. The top editor, Kate White, knew about the situation. She told no one about it throughout the whole captivity, which is pretty incredible in an industry, based on news and somewhat gossip. I met, with people in our government. I met with Richard Holbrooke, Hillary Clinton. They all helped advocate on the political front. And the translators that David knew, I had met kind of over the course of the years when they came to America. They were really helpful in the initial calls to the New York Times bureau in Kabul about my husband, translating phone calls, telling me kind of what to say from a cultural aspect. Even though they're calling you to demand prisoner and ransom for your husband, make sure you say salam alaikum, peace be with you, and kind of set the tone and then talk from there. So it was really just such a whirlwind. And the remarkable thing for me is that after this experience, David wasn't bitter about Afghanistan when he returned. It was such a passion for him. It was almost a third party in our relationship at times, because everything had to kind of work around the trips to Afghanistan as well, and we had to deal with the transition of going over and then when he returned. It was amazing to me that he still had that passion. He still saw the good in the country. The translators who I mentioned helped me very early on, about a week into the captivity. They knew I was a photography editor, and they gathered photographs, postcards of different places in Afghanistan, Panjshir, I think Bamiyan, where they once had the Buddhas. And they sent them to me along with a note saying, we want you to know there's another Afghanistan. There's beauty in our country. We're sorry this has happened to you, but we want you to know that not all Afghans are like this. So that was very moving.
I'm sure that was some comfort. So in the release, actually, it was the Afghans who ended up helping this
He actually
happen.
escaped, and it was his Afghan translator that had kind of known the lay of the land of where they were. They were held in houses in Pakistan. They were quickly brought into Pakistan from Afghanistan after his capture. And we knew that because the few calls I received were traced to Pakistan, not Afghanistan. And really, I do believe that he and the translator sort of saved each other. They were not isolated from each other in captivity. His translator knew there was a base perhaps nearby, and when they were able to escape, they were able to walk to it. And I'm just so thankful for that as well. I know people have been held since then and have not been as lucky. And we really are very lucky in retrospect to have survived and live to tell about it.
No question. And again, the story recounted in beautiful detail is in the book. So, David, none of us can imagine the horror of being held against our will and in a scary and dangerous place. Fortunately, you're here to talk about it. And what are you feeling and thinking now about that experience? Were there profound lessons? Were there changes? What happened to you inside as a result?
It was, very depressing, to be honest, to go into the tribal areas of Pakistan. And essentially, the Taliban have a mini-state there. They're essentially tolerated, some say supported by the Pakistani military. We can get into why later on. But they had these delusional ideas about, 9/11 was staged by the CIA and the Mossad, that it was to create a pretext to sort of occupy Muslim countries. And they believed that American soldiers were forcibly converting Afghans to Christianity. And we're talking about gender here. They were absolutely convinced that Afghan women were being forced to work as prostitutes on American military bases. The initial demands for my release were $25 million in cash and 15 prisoners from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And it's, I spent hours, days, weeks talking with them, and, again, the vast majority of Afghans are wonderful and fantastic, but there is a threat. They are delusional, they are violent. ISIS is worse, I would argue, but it was really stark. And, and it made me feel more for the Afghans who are risking their lives. They hated the two Afghans who worked with me, the driver and the translator, more than they hated me. They were gleeful when a suicide bomber went into a mosque in Pakistan and killed other Muslims. They saw them as not true Muslims. So that's why I have so much respect for Noorjahan and my friends. And one note, I've learned my lesson. I don't cover conflict anymore. I have not been back to Afghanistan in 5 years. I'm incredibly lucky to be married to this woman, and we're the parents of 2 daughters. Since I came home, we were lucky enough to have them.
But you're continuing your work as a journalist, and yes, welcome home. And so Noorjahan, it is so good you're with us, because you are, even though you're studying at American University now, you are there seeing this. And what we see so often about Afghanistan, are the killings, the kidnappings. I mean, even this week in the New York Times, there was a story of the translators and the people who help Americans and what has happened to them and how horrible that is. That doesn't quite jive with the story that you are seeing evolving in Afghanistan too. Share that with us. Women writers, women taking their positions of responsibility. How optimistic are you about your country?
I would say I'm optimistic, and I think that's very, very unexpected about Afghanistan. Rarely people say that. And I'm optimistic because I've seen firsthand the youth who are taking action to change Afghanistan. Around 70% of Afghans are under the age of 30. We are a generation of millennials. We are a generation of young people, and we are thirsty for knowledge. We are thirsty for jobs. We are striving every day, struggling to make things better. And I see this every day. I see this in the fact that 37% of Afghan teachers are women. In a country like Afghanistan, that in 2001 we didn't even have one girls' schools. That I think is amazing. My mom is one of those teachers. She has been a teacher for 17 years, and we have pushed her to retire so many times, and she doesn't because she believes in education. My father is a writer. Thank you. And I think my parents in some ways symbolize the Afghanistan that I see. They have done everything they can to train and educate 5 daughters and 2 sons to become fighters for a better Afghanistan. And they have been threatened. They have had to lose their house. My dad at one point had a library of 5,000 books. We joked about whether he loved his kids more or his books. But they left it all so that we will be able to get an education. And that's the Afghanistan that I see. Recently, a report by Asia Foundation said that 96% of Afghans believe that women and men should have equal opportunities in education. The Western world does not know about that, does not know that that's reality. A large number of my friends are female photographers, female writers, female journalists. Shakila Ibrahim Khail is single-handedly changing the way media is talking about women in Afghanistan. She works for Tolo TV. She writes mostly about women's issues, and she goes to dangerous places. She interviews people. That's the Afghanistan that I see. And I think by focusing on these violent images of Afghanistan, we marginalize women like Shakila. We marginalize women like my mother, because we make them secondary, we make them less important, and we make it seem like their words and their pen and their cameras are not as strong as the weapons of the Taliban. But I wholeheartedly believe that they're stronger.
Well, if you continue to speak like that and to write Thank you, right. Those are the voices of Afghanistan that we're not hearing, and they're also the images that we're not seeing. But one image that we have seen a lot lately that is giving us a deeper sense of hope and optimism is Mrs. Rouleghani, the First Lady of Afghanistan. A role model? Talk to us about the impact that you've already witnessed of her in the country.
Absolutely. I think Rola is definitely a role model. I think Ms. Ghani portrays a new picture of Afghanistan in the world, and she has been so outspoken to call out Western media for not portraying this progressive, thriving community of Afghans in Afghanistan. What I love most about Rola is that she's a sign of how much Afghanistan has changed and how Afghanistan is not what the Taliban want it to be. I could not imagine a Muslim First Lady in America. I'm sure you couldn't either. But we have a Christian First Lady in Afghanistan. That is tremendous. The fact that people have not risen up against her, that people support her, that she speaks publicly, she stands next to her husband, I think that's amazing. And I think the most wonderful thing about it, and I've talked to my parents about it, is this, that my parents have a faded memory of Soraya Tarzi, who was one of the first female First Lady, always female First Ladies, as they often are, to speak up in public next to King Aman Allah Khan. And she made it mandatory for girls and boys to go to school. She created the first girls' school. She created the first newspaper for women in Afghanistan. This is back in 1925. So like you said, I think that Afghan women are not necessarily going forward in the way that the Western media often portrays it, but rather we are trying to find our roots. We believe that our roots are not the Taliban. We believe that our roots are not the Mujahideen. But our roots are women like Soraya Tarzi, our roots of women like Rabah, who was a poet in 4th century. Our roots are Gawharshad Begum, who was a lady in the 13th century who built schools for girls, who educated girls. That is what my root is, an Afghan woman.
And in spite of the criticism of her and the concern inside, Mrs. Ghani has continued, as you say, to speak up and to be very present. What's also present, Kristin, and I think about your work as a photo editor, are still those images that are competing constantly. We don't see the images that we're hearing now. We see very different images. You made a conscious decision about the images of your husband in captivity. Can you talk about that?
Yes, we made a decision early on, and let me say, for other families who have people in captivity, the choices aren't always up to you. You're largely at the mercy of what the captors want to do. But in our situation, we decided not to go public. It was a decision we made every 3 to 5 days based on what was going on in the world, based on information we had in our case. So we did not take it lightly. We were both in the media, so we knew what that meant. And we had a lot of support from colleagues. But one of the things that struck me personally, after David returned, we wrote our book. We went on a media tour. And we did some appearances on television where we were asked about the situation. And in one of the interviews, before the interviews, it was a pre-recorded interview. The man asked us about our situation. And then he said, would you be willing to provide footage of the hostage videos? And we fought so firmly as a family, and his New York Times as well, to keep his image out of the press during the captivity and afterwards, because I was pregnant very soon after he came back. And it was just kind of shocking to me that here we've gone through this situation. If you could garner information from someone who's gone through such a tremendous life event, that the first thing you would want would be footage of the hostage video. Never mind what have you learned or how has this changed you. And I just think in our news cycle, 24 hours, those worst images get the most play, unfortunately. And I was struck recently, Warren Weinstein was another hostage who was killed, unfortunately, by a drone strike recently. And I was watching the coverage on television, and I was so thankful. I had seen images of him in captivity on the news, with the long beard and the Islamic State flag behind him. I was so relieved for his family that the images they chose to show, and it was actually on CNN, on Brooke Baldwin's show, were of him as a grandfather, as a normal person, And I know, for a family who has been an advocate for their loved one in captivity and afterwards, I was so happy for them. It's a small victory, but I'm sure it gave them tremendous peace of mind to have, the final image of their loved one out there be as a father and a grandfather and not as a captive yeah.
And images do change the narrative, and the narrative changes the way that we feel and how engaged we are or not. And David, in particular, in Afghanistan, we've seen such fluctuation in the U.S. policy toward this country. I mean, we're in, we're out, we're doing this, we're doing... And now, as a reporter at Reuters, not going back to the country, but still looking at it from the media's perspective, how do we change the narrative about what's going on there, civil society, the government, and in a way that Americans care?
It's very difficult, and we were joking earlier that I agreed to sort of take the blame for the media and the general very negative coverage. The sad truth is that sort of ISIS is very good with imagery. We'll talk about Farkhunda and her, the terrible attack in Kabul. That's an image, all Americans saw, not, Noorjahan and the many other Afghans. And it's hard. There's a joke in the media, if it bleeds, it leads. If it's some kind of violent thing, if it's a hurricane, a terrorist attack, ratings go up. It's a chicken and egg argument. If there was sort of more positive news, would people watch it or not? But certainly if you do negative news, if you have partisan news, it drives up ratings. So we wrote our book together, and then I wrote a book when I came back called Beyond War, which was all about, and this is why I love Women for Women, it was all about how do you empower local people in these countries to solve these problems. Because it's all about Noorjahan and other Afghan friends I have, and you're right about the inconsistency. We send in 100,000 troops, try to do everything ourselves, frustrate the Afghans in the process, frustrate ourselves under the Bush administration. And then with the Obama administration, there was a brief surge, but it was sort of a time-limited effort. We quickly throw up our hands, and I'm just being honest, there's sort of a sense, there's a reaction to George W. Bush on the American left that the U.S. just makes everything worse wherever we go, we can't do anything right, and we should just get out of these countries. And I think that would be a huge mistake in Afghanistan. We've achieved a tremendous amount. It costs too much money. We lost too many lives, too many Afghan and American lives, but there really has been progress. We need to be more patient and long-term.
And on that subject, David, when it was announced first that the U.S. was withdrawing its troops, the cry from the Afghan people was, it's worse for us if the media leaves than it is if the soldiers leave. In particular, I think women led that concern. And that is sort of borne out, isn't it, Noorjahan, by what you read and hear about the way Afghans really do feel about the media. Why is it? What's the important role, and how can we shift it so it starts to tell a fuller, richer story?
I think a big part of it is allowing Afghans to tell the story. I want to see more op-eds by Afghan women in the New York Times. I want to see, recently the New York Times published an article about the way that the police were marginalized, the female police. And my really good friend Wajma Farooq, who's an activist in Afghanistan, wrote back and said, actually people love the female police because they don't want men touching their wives. And that disconnect between Afghan writers and advocates and activists and Western media is a big one. I think it's very, very important to bridge that gap. And I think as long as the press stays focused on Afghanistan, people like Mujib Mashal, who recently wrote about a story about the love stories of Kabul, of how the new generation is doing much more love marriages than arranged marriages, and how that's changing the society as a whole. Those stories that tell human stories are much more likely to be written if they're written by Afghans. So I think creating that arena, that platform for Afghans to be their own storytellers is important, to create their own narratives. Another thing it does is it highlights in Afghanistan the importance of allowing women to write, of allowing young people to write, of allowing us to learn English so that we can write for international platforms. That is incredibly important. Unanimously, any Afghan I've talked to, even if they're on the religious right, think that media should exist. Some of them will argue that the right right-wing, radical Muslim media should exist, and that exists. Some of them will argue that more progressive media should exist, and that exists. And I think that's wonderful. That's what democracy is to be able to voice all these opinions. And I think if people have a peaceful way to express themselves, which what media allows us to do, and to protest, which also media lets us do, then the chances of a bloody protest will decrease. And we have seen this. Recently, I was in 2011, after a 4-year break and no protests about women's rights, I organized a protest against street harassment. And since then, there's monthly protests. And these are women who, one time when I was protesting, a parliamentarian told me that she was afraid somebody would throw acid on my face because of protesting. And I know that every other woman who's protesting now in Afghanistan knows that these are these risks, but they're going out there, and that's because they think that the media is listening. And the moment the media stops listening, they don't feel that the government has the infrastructure to support them. And of course, the Taliban are far from being saviors for Afghan women. We'll be left bare. We will have no support if there isn't media. And I think a pitch for Women International. I think equally important are aid organizations. Organizations that empower women by educating them, and not only educating them, but by economically empowering them, are essential. I've seen it in my own life. Having my own income changed the way I lived my life. It allowed me to choose my own partners. It allowed me to choose my own school, what I would study, where I would go, what time I would come home. And these little freedoms, multiplied by 15 million women in Afghanistan, is a revolution. It's nothing short of that.
I can't think of a better way to end this and send this out into the world than to think of that. 50 million Afghan women is a revolution. And we know that Women for Women International is already serving hundreds of thousands of them, and men too are now coming into the program. So one final reflection before we see some really wonderful images of current Afghanistan. Kristin, David, what do you say to your friends who go, oh boy, what an experience you had there, and still explain your optimism and your enthusiasm for the country?
Well, I never lost sight of the fact that it was a sad situation all around, as victims of a kidnapping. But even the people, that there was no other opportunity than kidnapping for work. And I think empowering people locally, but working within what they're used to, within their culture, the very word of mouth kind of culture and whatnot, and helping, empower women, I think just helps empower everyone. So, yeah. And
David, you've written about it in your book Beyond War, but final thoughts on that?
There is a vital role and a healthy role for empowering Noorjahan and others. One thing, though, that came out of, I covered the war in Bosnia, is there is a security issue. Law and order first was the term that came out of Bosnia and Kosovo. That if you don't have a basic level of security, none of the NGOs can work, none of the female activists are safe, none of the foreign journalists can work. And again, my time with, this was a more extreme element of the Taliban. I think there's less extreme elements that maybe you can negotiate with, but there is a threat. So, the United States has a responsibility to keep some troops there in the short term, but to fund the Afghan security forces. A record number of Afghan soldiers and Afghan policemen have died in the last year fighting the Taliban. They believe in Noorjahan and a new, sort of more modern Afghanistan. I get this thing, where are the moderate Muslims? 5 times as many Afghans have died fighting the Taliban as American soldiers. You don't hear that enough. So we need to listen to the Afghans more and keep doing our part slowly over time, and be optimistic about what we can do, in the world. We don't want to do huge invasions. We don't want to just withdraw. There is some middle ground. We do have partners, and that's the most important word, is partners.
And we do have young women like Noorjahan leading the way forward. Your sister is in Afghanistan, and I understand she took some photographs so that we might leave this luncheon today with images of very recent images of Afghanistan and the words of Noorjahan.
Thank you. Last fall, Rada captured these photographs in the training. These pictures tell the story of the women of my country. Women like Fatima, a young mother of 3 living in Dashtabarchi, a neighborhood of Kabul. Like so many women, her education was cut short when she was married. But 2 years ago, Fatima joined Women for Women International's programs. There, she found an opportunity to connect with other women in safe spaces. And together, they learned numeracy, basic business skills, and vocational skills to help them overcome poverty. They talked about their rights and shared their ideas on how they can stand up for themselves in their families and in their communities. These women are finding strength in each other to build a new future, not just for themselves, but also for their children. Today, Fatima is the leader of an association of 20 women. They call themselves Haqyar, the Friends of Truth. Though they rely on others to sell their products in the market, their income is providing clothing, pens, and notebooks for their children, and hope for their families. Women still face discrimination, but men are joining efforts to become allies, to be part of the solution, to reduce barriers for women. As Afghan women overcome the many challenges they face, they know they have the support of each other and the determination to move forward. Thank you.